And we are live. Welcome to Crypto Law TV. I'm John Deaton, the founder and today's host. And notice I said today's host because in the near future, I've got some exciting changes happening at Crypto Law. We're going to get some great minds, not just mine. So stay tuned. It's going to happen in the near future. But today, I want to bring someone that I think is one of the warriors out there fighting against government overreach and fighting for smart, tailored regulation in this industry. And that is Sam Lyons, Director of Public Policy at Riot Blockchain. Hey, Sam.
Hey, John. Good to be with you again.
Thanks for coming back on. I didn't scare you away the first time, right?
No, I'm happy to be back here. It was a really good time the last time.
Absolutely. You're a friend of the show. You're a friend of the industry. I meant what I said. You're one of the warriors out there fighting. Today's topic is, speaking of fighting, I want everybody to go to Crypto Law. We're still, the Connect to Congress tab is making a difference. We're asking the chairman, Patrick McHenry, to issue that subpoena to the SEC. So please, always take the time. It's 30 seconds of your life to try to make a difference and get that subpoena issued. We need transparency in this government. All right. So what I want to talk to you today, Sam, is about the impact of the U.S. government's war on crypto. And the first thing I'd ask is, do you believe that is that hyperbole on my part, that there's this war on crypto?
I don't think it's hyperbole at all, John. I mean, when you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, there's a very concerted effort from multiple executive agencies to attack or undermine crypto at every turn. Of course, you have the SEC, Chair Gensler sued Coinbase and Binance last year, found other ways to try to deem certain tokens in the space securities without much precedence for that. In addition to that, we also know that Senator Warren has declared herself the anti-crypto queen, more or less. She has raised an anti-crypto army, and she hasn't even hidden the fact that she wants to destroy this industry if she can in order to make way for a CBDC. So you also have the current administration attacking crypto through executive orders. We know that they actually, most recently through the Energy Information Administration, they're trying to go after the power source for Bitcoin miners. And so you have multiple agencies within the executive branch. You have the legislative branch. It's just this multi-pronged attack against the industry in general. So I don't think it's hyperbolic at all to say that there is a concerted effort to undermine this industry. And if you want to call it a war, I don't think that's hyperbolic at all when you have the self-appointed generalissima of the anti-crypto army being Senator Elizabeth Warren herself, saying that she's raising an army.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't think it's hyperbole. Senator Warren's bill is a de facto ban on self-custody of Bitcoin in the United States of America and bans other forms of crypto. You can give it any title you want. You can call it the Anti-Money Laundering Act or anything else, but we all know that it is an all-and-out ban. And then when you see what's going on with Custodial Bank and the Federal Reserve denying Caitlin Long and Custodial Bank a master account when the statute requires that they get it, and all the other things that we've seen go down in the last 2 years, there is a war. And it's not, I don't call it a war on crypto. I call it a war on freedom, because these aren't illegal assets. And in America, the last time I checked, you should be able to own an asset that you believe is worth owning, whether that be gold, silver, cash, or any other type of commodity, real estate. You should be allowed and afforded the opportunity to have that and not let the government tell you what you can and cannot own. And so, listen, this whole crypto and Bitcoin started as a form of decentralized currency, emphasizing financial equitability, the democratization, if you will, for the unbanked and the underbanked, and things that resonate with someone like me, whose mother didn't have a bank account until her 40s. And it was only then because the government welfare, required to have one. And so, what are your thoughts? Are we further away from that concept than we were years ago? Where are we at in that, in the whole concept behind this asset class?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Bitcoin, at the end of the day, in my opinion, is the perfect distillation of the American idea. Our country was founded on the idea that property rights are sacrosanct, they're not to be violated. And at the core of Bitcoin is exactly what you were saying, John, this idea that we should be able to own and custody our own property, our own assets. And what Bitcoin is it's a form of digital property. So you have two warring parties within the government. I think there's a faction that believes strongly in those founding ideals that we do have property rights that should be protected. And then you have another faction which wants more centralized control. And so the former I would describe as the pro Bitcoin faction. The latter I would describe as the pro CBDC faction. I think that's what this all comes down to at the end of the day. And that will be one of the biggest regulatory fights of the next decade is Bitcoin versus CBDCs. And so it's really to be determined who will win that war. Like we were saying before, this is an all out regulatory war against our industry. And there are times when it seems like we are falling backwards, that we're not making progress. But then you see senators like Senator Lummis, for example, or Senator Tuberville or Senator Cruz. We have a lot of allies in government itself who are pro Bitcoin to the core, who are constitutional idealists, who believe that Bitcoin is central to the American idea and are willing to fight for our industry. So even though the regulatory waters are really murky right now, I think whether our industry survives or doesn't will be determined by what happens in Congress and in DC over the next 10 years.
No, I think you're right. Now, one thing that we saw, and it wasn't because the government did the right thing. The government was forced to do it. Grayscale filed the lawsuit against the SEC, and they won at the appellate level. And basically, what we saw was a spot ETF for Bitcoin recently be approved. And so there's obviously that good news. Before the spot ETF, I saw an estimate that about 52 million Americans owned Bitcoin / crypto. I was at a conference with Anthony Scaramucci, and he said that there's talk that with the introduction of the spot ETF, if you include the spot ETF, then that went from 52 million Americans into the 80s million Americans who now have some exposure or ownership to this asset class. And so do you think that that this adoption on the spot ETF will advance that ideal that you and I have been talking about, or is it just going to benefit the Wall Streeters?
At the end of the day, I think the Bitcoin ETF is an unequivocal win for Bitcoin itself. And I know that there's some dispute within the industry as to whether or not this is Bitcoin selling out to the man, becoming something that's the sole ownership of Wall Street, and that Wall Street will corrupt this pristine asset class. But at the same time, you have to recognize that this is the best bridge we have to normies. And by normies, I mean, your grandma in Kansas or your baby boomer parents in the heartland who might not know how to do self custody, who might not really understand what cold wallets are. This is the easiest thing for them to get onboarded into the Bitcoin economy. All they have to do is they can get direct exposure to the fastest growing asset of the last decade with the click of a mouse. It's a simple call to their financial broker at Fidelity or BlackRock or wherever it may be. So at the end of the day, if we are looking for true global adoption, I think the Bitcoin ETF is a necessary step on the path towards Bitcoin becoming one of the largest asset classes in the world. And I understand at the same time some of the criticisms of those who say that this undermines the ideal of self-custody. And in no way does the Bitcoin ETF preclude anybody from still using self-custody. I think that is still the ideal way to go. But this will be an incredible supercharged step forward for the industry, because now it's not just crypto punks and cypherpunks, and Gen Z and millennials and Gen X who are getting exposure to Bitcoin. It will be the people who are the wealthiest Americans and the wealthiest people across the world, which is the baby boom generation. They will now be able to get very easy access to Bitcoin. I think more and more you'll see Bitcoin become a fixture of people's financial portfolios in the same way that gold is a fixture for lots of people's financial portfolios today. Bitcoin's been described not just as digital gold, but as exponential gold, given its price action over the last decade. It's appreciated in price at an exponentially larger size than gold itself. And arguably too, its stock to flow ratio is higher than gold's as well. And so you can see Bitcoin as the most rare asset on planet Earth. Only 21 million will ever exist. And millions of those 21 million have already been lost, we know as well. And so it's simple math. This is a fixed asset that's incredibly scarce. And as more and more people buy into this asset, the price will continue to increase as they realize that this is potentially one of the greatest stores of value that humanity has access to.
Okay, we've been talking about the economy. Let's move on to security. A couple questions. You hear about right now, for example, Senator Warren's. She calls it the anti-money laundering bill. I call it the bankers' ban on Bitcoin bill. I think my title is a bit more accurate. But you hear these talks of that. For national security reasons, we must outlaw this asset class. Do you think the U.S. is weaker because of its regulatory approach to how it's been handling cryptocurrency?
I do, John. And I also think that your description of this bill is far more accurate than Elizabeth Warren's, because at the end of the day, what do we know about this bill? We know that the banking lobby actually helped write the bill itself, which makes all the sense in the world. Bankers, the legacy incumbents here in this situation, they recognize that crypto is a threat. Whether it's DeFi or Bitcoin, the promise of digital assets is that it allows individuals to be their own banks. Essentially, it removes the middleman from the equation. And who's the middleman? It's the banks. And so naturally, they'll do everything they can to build a regulatory moat around their industry. And funny enough, they found an ally in Senator Elizabeth Warren, who used to be the greatest enemy of the banks. But now she's one of their greatest allies in Congress because she's working hand in hand with people like Jamie Dimon to ban Bitcoin effectively. And it's not a law that says outright Bitcoin is illegal to hold in custody in the United States, but it's a law that poisons the regulatory well in such a way that it will make it all but impossible to do anything Bitcoin adjacent or even crypto adjacent in the United States. So here's the problem, and this is how I believe at the end of the day it actually undermines national security. First, we need to look at the details here because Senator Warren's entire strategy depends on public ignorance. What she's trying to do is she's trying to cherry pick certain instances when Bitcoin or crypto or stable coins in some way have been involved in illicit finance. And then she's projecting those out through her allies in the media without any context whatsoever of how crypto's involvement in illicit finance compares with the use of fiat currency in illicit finance. And we actually just saw this a couple weeks ago. So Senator Warren, during a congressional hearing, she pointed out that $900,000 worth of crypto had been used by the Sinaloa cartel for illicit finance. So she put that forward to grab headlines, essentially. People she thought would freak out if they realized, oh, the Sinaloa drug cartel is using crypto to finance their operations. And so that figure, though, $900,000 pales in comparison to the $900 million that were used by the Sinaloa and Norte de Valle cartels in Colombia to launder money through HSBC in the prior decade. So that's a fiat to crypto ratio of 1,000 to 1. And again, Senator Elizabeth Warren doesn't want us to know the facts in this situation because the facts bear out. And people outside of the crypto industry who don't support the industry at all have admitted, no, this is true. Fiat is by far and away the preferred currency of criminals. Crypto is a dalliance for organizations like Hamas and others. But at the end of the day, the predominant use of money laundering today is through traditional means. It is through the banks. It is using credit cards. It's using all of these things that Senator Elizabeth Warren wants to pretend don't exist. And so at the end of the day, it's an issue of threat assessment. Any military commander on the field, he has to assess all the threats in front of him, and he has to label which threats are the most immediate and present the biggest danger to his troops, right? That's what's so dangerous, I think, about Senator Warren's diatribe against crypto is it's this minor, tiny, minuscule threat compared to the threat of illicit finance used with fiat currency. And she's focusing, though, all of her attention on the small little threat, hoping people will just ignore the larger threat that's out there, which, again, is traditional finance.
Right. Well, let me give you just a couple real quick comments. One, I'll say what I said on Charles Payne's Fox Business show, Making Money with Charles Payne, when this topic came up. And I said, you have to be a moron if you're going to use the blockchain as a means of illicit activity. The FBI, the CIA, they've all come out and said that they hope so. Matter of fact, Hamas gave one of the leadership gave a directive that said stop using. There was a little bit of money used to transport donations to Hamas, and they said stop doing it. It's too traceable. It's a public ledger. And finally, it's all about this concept. You don't ban something, right? Let me ask you, Sam, do you think that an ATM machine has ever been used in a cash drug situation where someone goes to the ATM, they take out some cash and they buy some cocaine or marijuana when it was more illegal or any of that? Do you think that's ever happened?
You know what? I'm sure it's happened, and the only solution is to ban ATMs.
Right. Do we ban ATMs? Of course not. So, it's really silly. And you made a couple excellent points that I wish people would latch on to. Let's move on to an article that came out. It was on CoinDesk, and it was something put out by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And it's another back to our thesis on a war on crypto. And you recently, basically, this was a mandatory survey of how much energy Bitcoin miners are consuming. And you recently said on X that this may be Operation Checkpoint 3.0. I got to believe this is something very, very important to you, with who you work for and what you've been trying to accomplish since you've been in this industry. Could you expand on what you were talking about?
Absolutely. So, to understand Operation Choke Point 3.0, it's first necessary to understand Operation Choke Point 2.0, which took place last year. And that's where the federal government went after the banks that had anything to do with Bitcoin or digital assets. The idea behind that is really every company has two forms of lifeblood. It's money and energy, right? So Operation Choke Point 2.0 went after the money, the ability of Bitcoin miners and other digital asset companies to bank and to have some kind of off ramp into fiat currency. Operation Choke Point 2.0 tried to debank a lot of these companies within the industry, right? So, what is meant by Operation Choke Point 3.0? And credit to Jason Brett and Brian Morgenstern for, I believe they were the first ones to coin that term. But Operation Choke Point 3.0 is going after not necessarily the money that Bitcoin miners depend on, but the energy that we depend on. And so what is happening with Operation Choke Point 3.0 is you have the Energy Information Administration is essentially requiring an audit of all Bitcoin miners across the country. And they're circumventing usual procedural processes to make this audit mandatory. Usually you have to get permission from the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, to have any kind of audit like the one that they want to do with Bitcoin miners. But they've declared this an emergency. And I say that in quotations because by all, you look at it closely, for all intents and purposes, there's no emergency whatsoever. What emergency have Bitcoin miners presented to the grid over the past couple of years? They really don't have any evidence for it. And what they actually use as their evidence in their letter explaining the reason behind this emergency order is the fact that there was a cold snap in January. But the cold snap that they allude to in Texas, what happened? Did Bitcoin miners present any threat to the grid whatsoever? Quite the opposite. They powered down well in advance of the cold snap even happening, so much so that 34% of the Bitcoin hash rate across the world was reduced because so many Bitcoin miners across the US, in an effort to be good grid citizens, turned off their power completely to give power back to the grid to ensure that the lights would stay on, that the heat would stay on in homes across Texas and the South. And so it's a completely false pretext that this is based on. The issue, though, John, is that honestly, if they were to audit this information, if they were to succeed somehow, it's a fool's errand, because what they would realize is that, yes, Bitcoin miners, we consume electricity like every industry out there, but we consume it in such a way that it's actually good for the grid, that it provides stability to the grid, that it incentivizes renewable energies, for example. I like to say, and I've heard it said more eloquently in different ways, Bitcoin is not a waste of energy. it makes use of energy that would otherwise be wasted. So Bitcoin miners, when the grid really is stressed, when there's high demand for energy, that's when we shut off because the prices for us are too high. It's not economically viable for us at that point to even mine. And so we shut off. So when there is that extreme stress on the grid that the EIA purports to be worried about, we're not even part of the action. We've shut off well in advance of that happening. So what this is at the end of the day is it's an attempt to malign the industry and to paint it as something that is bad for grids or is bad for the environment, which again is the opposite of the truth. But I think what this administration recognizes is that this is all information warfare at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
this is an opening salvo in an attempt to smear the industry as something that's bad for the power grid, when in fact it's the opposite.
And it also proves that no good deed goes unpunished, because there you go, the miners out there being good corporate grid citizens, if you will, and yet get a maligned. Speaking of the administration, I want to play a video that just came out of the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and let's play that, and then I want to get your thoughts.
Council is focused on digital assets and related risks, such as from runs on crypto asset platforms and stablecoins, potential vulnerabilities from crypto asset price volatility, and the proliferation of platforms acting outside of or out of compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Applicable rules and regulations should be enforced, and Congress should pass legislation to provide for the regulation of stablecoins and of the spot market for crypto assets that are not securities. We look forward to continuing to engage with Congress on this. With this.
Okay, now I think that the Treasury Secretary might be a little more concerned about those things called bank runs on the traditional banking system, because if you take away the FTX situation, even when Binance got sued, and even when Coinbase and other exchanges saw lots of withdrawals, if the assets are there, you're not worried about a bank run. And I just want to remind everyone of the hypocrisy. The U.S. Treasury Secretary is talking about runs on crypto platforms, yet Custodial Bank has this revolutionary idea that they're going to have 101 or 108% reserves. So whatever you have in their account, it's always going to be there and then some. So there can, by definition, never be a run, because the assets are always there. We cannot say that about the banking system. But let me ask you, here we have a request by the Treasury Secretary saying that there needs to be legislation, Congress needs to act. And my first question is, do you think we've lost the innovation race? Do you think it's too late? Or do you think there's still time for the United States to lead?
I think there is still time, but that time is dwindling, because at the end of the day, why is the US the technological leader of the world? It's because we had fairly loose policies towards technology in the late 90s that allowed for companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter to form and develop into what they are today. So what we risk right now, though, if we don't get the regulatory circumstances right, we risk losing out on becoming the Web3 capital of the world. And that's a real risk, especially with how hostile the current administration has been at various turns towards our industry, and how hostile some members of Congress are as well. I do think we do have time, though. And something that disappoints me about Secretary Yellen, her testimony just now, is that there are so many people in the US government who want to regulate stablecoins out of existence. What they don't recognize is that stablecoins, in fact, are a huge asset, or can be a huge asset to economic statecraft. In fact, stablecoins that are tied to the US dollar can be used as a tool of economic statecraft to increase dollarization throughout the world. An interesting statistic is that 1 in 3 people in South America has used a stablecoin before. You have people in countries like Venezuela, for example, that are ravaged by hyperinflation. They're just looking for any kind of refuge they can find to protect themselves from their own fiat currencies, which are inflating away. So what they do oftentimes is they turn to dollars. So by having a very clear regulatory framework for stablecoins that balances the need to increase their use, but also make sure that they're well backed by proven reserves, we need that. I don't want to deny that. But if we can make that happen, we can actually increase dollarization abroad, which would increase U.S. Financial, economic, and cultural power throughout the world. And there's this impetus, this desire in Washington to just consider them dangerous outright. But no, if you get the regulation right with stablecoins, they can be a tremendous economic asset to the United States.
You said, and we got a couple more minutes and we got to wrap up, but let me ask you, Bill Hinman gave a speech in 2018 where he said Bitcoin and ETH were not securities. And that was, such big news. That's almost 6 years ago. And yet today you have the SEC chair who won't even admit whether or not ETH is a security. And you had to sue despite that statement in 2018 that Bitcoin was not a security. You had to sue. The industry had to sue to get a spot ETF. And so I agree with you. The clock's ticking, but do you think we got 5 more years of wasted and it's too late? Or do you think that it's sooner or later than that?
Yeah, I think we will have a more clarity with what's going to happen over the next 2 years. And I think this upcoming election is consequential in so many ways because we're swimming against the tide right now. When you have the entire executive branch and a huge chunk of Congress working against us, it's hard. We're just treading water at this point, and so it's difficult to stay afloat. But I do believe that with some electoral changes, we could have greater clarity come to our industry in the next couple years, even. So we have made already huge progress this year with the crypto framework that was passed in the House, right? But at the same time, we know that for that to pass in the Senate, there needs to be some changes there. And so it'll be interesting to see what develops. But I think what you'll notice in 2024 and what only a few politicians are recognizing now is that the crypto vote, if you want to call it that, is absolutely massive. As you mentioned earlier, about 52 million people own crypto across the United States, which is a much larger number than in the last presidential election in 2020. So over the last 4 years, you have millions of crypto voters who have come onto the scene who these sorts of policies affect their pocketbooks in every way. And you can bet that they're going to vote for the kind of candidates who are pro crypto. And so I think for us to have a better regulatory environment, crypto voters need to wake up. They need to recognize the power they have. And a lot of them are more libertarian or more skeptical of politics or government in general. So maybe they've stayed out of the political scene in the past few years. It's not the time to do that anymore. Now's the time to stand up and let your voice be heard, because your voice counts and it matters. And it really could affect the regulatory landscape for crypto and digital assets over the next decade.
Listen, I'm not going to touch that. That was perfect. I can't say it any better. I'm going to hope that you come back on Crypto Law in the future. We have some changes that are going to take place in the near future, and maybe we can even get you to sit in my chair a couple episodes. What do you think of that?
That sounds great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week. Thanks, Sam, for coming. I'll see you next week.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
Thank you.